Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be back here in beautiful Boulder. It's lovely to be back with the JLF family. I had the great honor of fulfilling a lifelong dream of presenting at JLF in Jaipur in January, and it just has continued to fill me with magic. So it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you to Abby. Thank you to the entire TeamWorks team. It's really just such an honor. And I'm excited to be a part of this panel. I have not yet had an opportunity to be a part of this kind of a format. So as Abby mentioned, I'm Pardis Mahdavi, and I'm going to be speaking first. The way that we've decided to organize our conversation this morning, the three of us met a couple weeks ago on a brief Zoom call, and we decided that the best way for us to be in conversation is to initially kind of explore the way our work is related to the theme. And then, so each of us will do that. I will go first. Parul will go second. Shastri will go third. And we'll read just a few tidbits from our books. And then we each have a question for each other, a question that we've kind of been meditating on as it relates to the theme of the panel. And then, of course, we'll turn to Q&A. So, you know, the theme I think that we've all been really exploring, and I certainly want to talk about, is that very first sentence of the description for this panel. So the panel is called I for Identity, and we've really taken to heart that very first sentence, which is the stories we hear, tell, and retell about ourselves, right? The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we hear about ourselves, and the stories we retell ourselves as they come into a self-narrative that we then recognize as an identity. So that's really that kind of central theme that we're going to be unpacking. And so I have the great privilege, I guess, of going first. As Abby mentioned, I've written actually 8 books, nonfiction. And my latest book, my 9th book, comes out in January. It's called Riding. R-I-D-I-N-G. And the reason I say riding is because it's actually a meditation on how my riding informs my writing. I'm a horse girl. So if you come this afternoon, I have the great privilege of being in conversation with Ruchira Gupta about my other book, Book of Queens, which is the true story of the Middle Eastern horsewomen who fought the war on terror. And I'll tell you that story this afternoon. But my forthcoming book is called Riding, and it's actually about how my riding impacts my writing and how my writing impacts my riding. And that, in addition to Hyphen, the book that I wrote just before Book of Queens, has been a process of self-excavation. And it's been really a journey for me about learning to wade through the stories that I've been telling myself about myself, and the stories, the narratives, the curations, the manufactured image. And the way that I've experienced these books has been through autoethnography. So I'm an anthropologist by training. Autoethnography is the process of turning the ethnographic or anthropological gaze on the self and getting really curious about how not just the way in which, you know, we interact with the world, but the way in which the world kind of is within us. And the process of writing both of these books has been a process for me of getting comfortable with the discomfort inside of me. And it's been a process of understanding, you know, one of the great myths, one of the great stories we hear and tell ourselves is that we're on a journey to find this one true self, as though there is a one true self static inside of us. And the reality is that we have many selves. And so if we just focus on this journey to find one self, we elide or eclipse the committee that kind of lives inside of us, right? I've got this daily committee of like self-loathing and self-judgment, but also there's like a little bit of narcissist and that manufactured self-image, and all of this has contributed to why I'm now a recovering academic as opposed to an academic. But you know, I think that you know, I think getting comfortable with all of the many parts of yourself and how they come out through what I call intersubjective relationships. So intersubjective relationships are the relationships that you have with people, places, or things that give you clues about who you are. So I have an intersubjective relationship, of course, with my partner, with my children, but I have an intersubjective relationship with horses. I have an intersubjective relationship with the ocean. I have a very complicated intersubjective relationship with Iran that I unpack in a lot of these books. And I have an intersubjective relationship with how I kind of suture my hyphenated identity as an Iranian American, right? And so writing and writing, for me, have been a process of finding the courage to face all those parts of my committee and getting curious about all the different me's that come out through intersubjective relationships. So what got me started on that actually was this book, Hyphen, that I wrote, which is about being a hyphenated American, but it actually tracks the journey of the hyphen as a grammatical mark and how the orthography, the hyphen as a grammatical mark, mirrors the journey of hyphenated Americans. And so I go all the way back to ancient Greece, where the hyphen was invented by Dionysius Thrax. And I look at how the hyphen was seen as something that was to signal belonging between two distinct things. Does the hyphen connect or does it divide? That was kind of the meditation that I was on. And it was that meditation that allowed me then to kind of crack open that exterior eggshell and get deeper and ask myself and get curious about riding, which is actually really about falling. And it's about how all my failures allowed me the courage to take the risks that I now take on the page. I'm writing my first fiction novel ever, and I wouldn't have had the courage to do that without either of those. So I'm gonna read a really brief passage and then pass it to my co-panelists. I'm actually gonna read the preface, and then I'm gonna read about Gutenberg's intersubjective relationship with the hyphen. But the preface of the book begins, to hyphenate or not to hyphenate has been a central point of controversy since before the imprinting of the first Gutenberg Bible. And yet, the hyphen has persisted, bringing and bridging new words and concepts. The journey of this humble piece of connective punctuation reveals the quiet power of an orthographic concept to speak to the travails of hyphenated individuals all over the world. For me, it took being kicked out of my ancestral home to wrap my limbs around the hyphen. As a hyphenated Iranian American growing up betwixt and between, I have struggled to find or make belonging. And I've learned that I'm not alone. Like many others whom I introduce in this book, I have learned that I don't have to fit on one side of the hyphen or the other, but rather I can embrace the space between. So many others like me have finally found a way to embrace their voice and the authority inside the hyphen itself. So this book is an invitation to join me and see how the journey of a humble grammatical marker has the potential to make belonging for hyphenated individuals struggling through identity politics today. And I'm just gonna read you a brief excerpt, not of my own hyphenated journey, which is sprinkled throughout the book, as well as the journey of 3 other hyphenated Americans, but I'm gonna actually introduce you to a different side of Gutenberg. Many of you have read the Gutenberg Bible, but how many of you know that he was actually, the reason he created the printing press is because he was born to a family of blacksmiths, and he ran away with a woman he fell in love with and wanted to write poetry. He was a poet. His parents brought him back and forced him to be what he didn't want to be, which was a blacksmith. But he invented the printing press so that he could write poetry. And that is actually how he created those beautiful justified lines, because he was an artist. So I'll just read briefly. For much of the 1440s, Johannes Gutenberg felt caught between 2 worlds. He was constantly traveling back and forth between his hometown of Mainz in the Rhine-Main area of Germany and Strasbourg. The son of Friel Geinschfleisch, a goldsmith, Johannes knew that continuing the trade was his duty. And while he loved working with metals, his secret passion was writing and experimenting with prints. Caught between a sense of familial obligation and a strong desire to strike out on his own, Johannes often felt torn. In the late 1420s, desperate to demonstrate his independence and creativity, he declared that he was changing his inherited last name. While he had been born Johannes Geinfleisch, John Gooseflesh in translation, he announced that he would be henceforth known as Johannes Gutenberg, a name that roughly translated to beautiful mountain. He felt that this name change lifted a great weight from his shoulders and gave himself permission to leave Mainz for Strasbourg in a quest to forge his own identity as a blacksmith poet.
Hello, everyone. Okay, can you all hear me? It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time at Boulder, and the only other time I've been to the Jaipur Literature Festival was in Jaipur right before COVID struck, so it's a very memorable year, but it was in 2020, and I was working as a journalist. I mean, I've always worked as a journalist, but I wrote about the Jaipur Literature Festival for the Los Angeles Review of Books. And I was awed by, I've never been to a book festival like that, with the theater, the beauty of the decorations, the enormous number of really excellent panels. And so it's really fun now to take part in it as a panelist here. I will be talking a little differently and maybe more personally, because I was thinking about identity formation. I was thinking of both my own identity formation and that of my characters. So this is my book, Inside the Mirror, and there's a woman's face here and there. They're twin sisters, and they are growing up in Bombay in the 1950s. They're about 20 years old when the book opens, and they both have a dream to be artists of different kinds. Jaya wants to be a painter. Her sister Kamlesh wants to be a dancer. And when I began this book has been my lifelong journey. So I was in my early 20s when I began it, and I really wanted to be a writer. So they are, in a way, alter egos of mine, but in a different era. And I guess the thing that formed my identity the most is I have the sense of disruption, because I was born in India, and I was about 8 years old when my father decided to immigrate to the US. I was almost 8, and so of course I had no idea of the real life issues, problems that he was having economically, financially, like why this big change was occurring. I only knew that we were going to America. And there was a period of transition because my father came here first to get a job and to get an apartment, so he didn't want to just bring us all over without having, any place to stay or having any financial means. And so it was my brother, me, and my mother living with my grandparents in New Delhi. So that was an unusual arrangement because we were with my grandparents. And I definitely sensed instability. I could feel things, but I didn't understand what was the reason for anything. And my mother says, you started to lie a lot in this period. I would just make stuff up because I think I was feeling so fearful and insecure. And I remember the one big lie or sort of made up story I told. Somebody asked me about America, or have you been there, or what is it like? Of course I had no idea. I just knew I didn't want to go. That was very clear to me. I did not want to leave the world that I knew. And so I told her, well, it's this place. She was a little older than me. She must have been 13 or 14. And I said, America is this place with giant mountains and snow all over. And now I'm thinking, like, did I have a premonition of Colorado? And there are trains going through tunnels in the mountains. Now I'm thinking, somehow I had imagined Switzerland. But, this was a picture I presented. So I was making things up in my mind. And so then we came here. And as I say, I did not want to come. And I didn't tell anyone that. I just felt like I didn't want to go to this place. And then I got out of the car. My dad took us to our apartment in New Jersey. Everything felt strange. Even the air felt strange, like it was very thin and cool. It was not heavy and kind of damp like Indian air. And then when I went to elementary school here, I was very much an outsider because it was 1969. There were no other Indians. There were no Asians even that I remember in my elementary school. It was a black and white community, Englewood, New Jersey. It was very mixed. And there was a black boy that used to sit right behind me in class. And he was curious, like, who is this person? Like, she doesn't look like a black person or a white person. So he would always ask me, are you black or are you white? That was his, like, constant question to me. And I said, I'm neither, because I didn't feel like either. And I didn't know how else to answer him. I always said, I'm neither. I'm not black and I'm not white. And then one day it struck me and I said, I'm brown. And he was like, no, that wasn't even an answer to him. It was like a cop-out. And so I always had this feeling of being an outsider. And, because it was the 70s and 80s, and there were very few. Then we moved to Connecticut, which was very like an all-white town. And so I was very much an outsider. I never felt like an American. I never even felt like a hyphenated American. I always identified myself as Indian, even though I didn't sound Indian. And when I went to India, people thought I was like American. But now, because Americans' definition of who is an American has changed, I can say that I kind of feel like I can be an American, but there's been a lot of resistance in me to that. And anyway, so, so I had this feeling that I don't really belong here, but I still enjoyed it. I was a journalist, even as a student, and I was always interested in the things around me. And so I went back to India after I finished my degree at Wesleyan. I went back to India, and I worked as a journalist for a year in Bombay. Then I came back. I thought I wanted to live back there, but then I didn't because my family was here, and I missed them. So I came here, I went to Columbia to do a master's in fiction writing, and that's when I actually started this novel, because someone told me that, to get published, you should have a novel and not short stories. So I started this novel, and I thought of it as like a story of a family from the 1950s, because my father would talk a lot about India growing up, which was in the 50s. He always told very positive stories, and then being a young adult, and then his first job was in Assam, and all these great parties at this company town that he lived in Assam. And so I thought, well, I know that period, and I know Bombay because I just spent a year there as a journalist, so I'll write this story about a family and what happens to them until the 80s, which was when I had actually started writing the novel. And then as I wrote, the focus became these two sisters who were artists, and I did not want to write about young women who wanted to be writers, because that to me was problematic enough in my own life. I didn't want them to be writers, but I loved art and I loved classical Indian dance, so I gave them these quests to be. Jaya wants to be a painter, and she's very interested in the modern art movement. And Kamlesh is interested in the ancient Indian art of Bharatanatyam. And so they are both, when you meet them, they are students of these arts, and they have these secret desires to make these arts their vocation, just as I had the desire to be a published writer. And so I was very forward-looking in their characters. In other words, I wanted them to reach their goal because I wanted to reach my goal. And I didn't have that many, there were obstacles in their ways, like their family and society, but they were relatively minimal. And I didn't recognize what were the disruptions in their life that made them want to be artists. And it's only in the revisions of this novel that I discovered what it was that made them. They didn't want to just be artists because, they had these talents. There was something that happened to them and that they experienced. So I will just read a couple of short passages from the book that will give you a sense, I hope, of what it is, the big disruption in their life, because this is the early 50s. So there was a big disruption in India called the Partition of India, when the British partitioned India into the Muslim state of Pakistan. So there was West Pakistan on one side of India, East Pakistan on the other, and India in the middle. And so this disruption, they were about 12 years old when they experienced this. And the scene that I'm going to read for you, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but it is a scene where the family, Jaya and Kamlesh's family, is commemorating the 5th death anniversary of their grandfather. He died a year after partition, and their grandmother now lives with them permanently. The grandfather also had, but then he died a year after he arrived at their home. So the grandfather is called Lalaji. As I say, this is his death anniversary ceremony. They have invited some extended family members who've also arrived in Bombay as refugees in 47. And so this is the ceremony. They're sitting on the ground. There's a fire where the priest is tending the fire, and they are just listening to his Sanskrit verses, and he's doing the fire rituals. Jaya pressed herself against Kamlesh, hearing Babaji's sighs, afraid the many deaths her grandmother had known were colliding in her mind. Not only Lalaji's passing, but her son Girdhari Lal's murder and her daughter Shivan Devi's death of typhoid fever. And before that, the loss of her first child, who died a few days after she gave birth to him. They had wrapped him in soft cloth and cast him in the Chenab River, Babaji once whispered, in Chinyot. Chinyot, Hafizabad, Jhelum, Okara, Sargodha, Lahore. These were places in the Punjab, now lost to Pakistan, whose names circulated in the family talk. Jaya and Kamlesh had been born in Sargodha, a city famed for its luscious oranges, a place they had no memory of. They had lived in a couple of towns in East Punjab too, before their father was transferred to Bombay when they were 5. The house they knew best in Punjab, their grandparents' home in Lahore, where they spent their summer vacations, was a mud brick building with a large courtyard, a few doors down from the Bharati school. Babaji had found them playmates among the schoolgirls when they were young, the daughters of her friends and neighbors, traipsing between the house and the school, waiting for their friends to be let out. They had a joyous feeling of belonging to their grandparents' lane, to the Gawal Mandi neighborhood. 3 days before partition, men came at night and set fire to the entire line of Hindu houses and the girls' school. Babaji's front room burned first. She and Lalaji, assisted by Deepi, who lived with them while attending college, managed to climb up the back boundary wall to escape. The family next door had perished inside their house. The Muslim fire tenders had sprayed water away from the flames, people said, to let the fire spread. Jaya felt as if she herself had seen the black ruins smoldering the next day, when Lalaji and Babaji went to retrieve their belongings. The houses disintegrated to mounds of ash. Her grandparents and Deepi arrived in Bombay, numb and silent. When Jaya heard that the fire had blazed across the whole lane, she'd wanted to burn down the houses of the men who'd burned Babaji's house. She'd wanted those men to burn. And this next section will just give you a sense of how their witnessing of the trauma that other people, their relatives, went through has affected them as artists. And this particularly focuses on Jaya, not so much on her sister, who's the dancer. So this is another reflection back. Jaya is looking at some old drawings that she made in childhood, and she's thinking back to this. It was in those days of partition, when she had been drawing a lot, making images of the terrible things she'd overheard, that she and Kamlesh had fought most bitterly. Together they would escape the flat, the ladies' silences worse than their tears, their appeals to God, home lost, land lost, gold lost, and the whereabouts of a daughter or a brother unknown. What happened to them? Where are they? The atrocities people had seen. Everyone went mad. One morning, she and Kamlesh wandered far from their locality, following a small road straight to the sea. A jetty of black rocks extended enticingly from the land's end, far away into the waves at high tide. And Jaya excitedly ordered Kamlesh to walk out there. They were alone, free to do anything. Puffed up with a sense of power, she wanted to make her twin obey her. Kamlesh submitted, despite her fear, persuaded to act bravely, screaming only when she reached the jetty's tip and crashing waves soaked her. Jaya, terrified that Kamlesh might be swept away, ran out on the loose, wobbly rocks to bring her twin back. Later, a fight erupted at home, and Kamlesh flung a shoe at Jaya in a rage, cracking the glass on the print she and Mummy adored of a little English girl looking lovingly upon a kitten playing in a basket of wool. That was when Mummy separated them, placing their 2 beds against opposite walls and positioning their relatives' cots between them. Kamlesh continued to join Jaya on the balcony, watching her sketch on the dirty floor. When she told Mummy about the pictures, their mother was horrified to find distortions and fragments of the incidents their relations had told him about, illustrated by her daughter's hand. She rightly connected Jaya's sketch of a boy striking a weak, bent-back man with a long stick to the silent boy who had visited their flat. He'd come with his parents, a college student who didn't speak, who looked like he was blind, his eyes empty and unfocused. The RSS had lured him into their cater, his mother said among the ladies, and she didn't know what kinds of things he might have done to Muslims. Maybe beat them, maybe more. He must have done terrible things, she cried. Look at him now. Vidya had studied Jaya's drawings closely. Why do you let these things trouble you? She scolded Jaya. Jaya looked at the drawings her mother held and couldn't formulate an answer. It lay buried within. How could she keep absorbing people's despair and not respond? You're safe and sound at home, her mother tried to assure her. Mummy found Matre Sahib through an acquaintance, hoping a drawing master could dispel her fears and guide her to things of beauty. At their first lesson, Matre Sahib looked over the drawings she was looking at now, of a terrified girl fleeing downstairs, of a girl staring at a key in her hand as big as her palm, of a flaming house that was not quite Baby Chee's house, glimpsed through a train window. Her bespectacled new teacher had gazed at her, a 13-year-old girl, and said without a smile, "Do you know, you're an artist." Okay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. It is my first time at any Jaipur Literary Festival across the world. So when I was invited to be on this panel and I read the description that Pardis you just shared, I thought about identity, and a lot of stories we tell ourselves are stories we inherit, right? Now, they're not just stories we simply invent out of thin air. We inherit these stories from the social ecosystems that we're a part of, whether it's family, extended family, social circles like your school or your friend group. And so there were two stories that I told myself that the act of writing this book disrupted. The first story is something which is very familiar, like a lot of Desis who migrated from southern India to the US through the 90s and early 2000s. Profession was for me just a way of earning good money and going to the US of A. And that profession was computer science. So I did my undergraduate in computer science, did not really like it. Somehow got hired into Google. After 7 rounds of interviews, I did not know how I did not get rejected. And I was surrounded by computer engineers who loved their job. They would get so excited if a code they wrote, one engineer wrote, ran 0.001 seconds quicker than another person's code. If somebody's code was like 1 line shorter, and I just did not care as long as the thing did its job. But the thing is, you can't compete with somebody who loves their job. So I was going to quit, but then I was given the offer of moving to their advertising team. So that sort of allowed me to defer the act of quitting a profession that was not mine. And we love deferring, making real decisions. That's one of the conditions of being human. But then, of course, the second reality that hit me, the second identity that hit me was that of my orientation. So I, growing up, believed I was asexual because I was not attracted to women. Through my teens, I went to an all-boys boarding high school, and every single boy in my year had at least 10 different crushes. And I did not know who thought that putting high school boys high on hormones in one place is a good idea. It's a terrible idea, having lived through that experience. And I grew up in a household of women with both my siblings and my mom, and I just really missed being around women, and I did not like my high school experience. But I said, if I'm not attracted to women, being attracted to men was not an option back then, so I just thought I was asexual. And that was something I was forced to confront, because there is this thing that, again, Desis would know, this thing called arranged marriage. So now that I had a job in Google and I was working in Dublin and in the US, pressure started coming in. I started receiving pictures of girls in my inbox saying, hey, you might want to get married to her. And I did not want to get married to any of them. So I did not know how to negotiate that space. And so I was traveling. I just kept refusing the arranged marriage, and I was traveling. And something about the act of traveling, specifically trekking in India and the Himalayas around these mountains, was very therapeutic for me, because the magnitude of these majestic ancient mountains that are timeless somehow made my problems feel small and insignificant and allowed me to forget about them for some time. And the act of traveling somehow, instead of going to nonfiction, wanted me to write fiction, and that's how I started writing this novel. And I realize now the impulse came from fiction allows you to hold reality at 1 degree of remove, and my own reality felt so overwhelming that I could not access it directly, which nonfiction would require you to. So I started writing the story of Shagun. I, like I said, did not have any training in the humanities, and I started writing this book and eventually decided to quit my job at Google, which, of course, my parents were horrified by, that I was quitting my job at Google to go do an MFA in creative writing. And before that, I'd taken 3 months, taken a leave on loss of pay at Google to work for a street theater troupe, because I wanted my main character to be a street performer. And I remember my dad saying, so street performers was people who sleep on railway platforms and collect money in a hat. I said, yeah, I couldn't see what was wrong with that. So then I joined the MFA program at UMass Amherst and submitted a big section of this novel, very, very early draft of this novel, as part of the workshop, as part of the critique. And my professor, Sabina Marie, said, this is dying to be a gay love story. Why aren't you letting it be one? And I remember being very upset with her, so I went into her office hours and I said, Shagun, the main character, and Mark are friends. Why would you say it's a gay love story? He's asexual. And she looked at me with the kindest pair of eyes, and she said, she pointed to a lot of areas in the story where she said, it's very clear that Shagun's in love with Mark. And she looked at me and said, you know, it's okay for him to be gay if he wants to. I'm sure he'll find a community. And she really emphasized the he. It's like, he'll find people who'll support him. He should be who he wants to be. So I then went to therapy. So it's a running joke between Sabina and me that I joined the workshop, and 10 days later I had to go into therapy. And she said, if you're telling the story in public places, please give them context. Don't just tell the story. So I went to therapy and came out on the last day of her workshop. And then, of course, I had to rewrite the whole book. I couldn't just do a find, replace friend with boyfriend. That's not how narrative works. So I rewrote the whole book. And one of the craft books I read in that time was by Charles Baxter on the art of subtext. And he talked about how subtext is that part of a story where it sort of bubbles under the surface. You keep ignoring it, and the subtext in a life is that element that we keep ignoring until there is a tremendous act of violence that sort of forces the subtext to rise to the surface. And for me, queerness was that subtext that I had to have the dismantling of both those identities for it to come to the surface. So it wasn't that my identity shaped the novel. Something about the act of writing the novel ended up shaping my identity. So it was the art that shaped me rather than me shaping the art. And of course, then once I came out and found a community and clarified what queerness means to me, because what queerness means to each person is very specific to who they are. And I realized the biggest value of queerness that I hold dear is that of found family. Because when an essential part of you is rejected by a biological family, when any of us who live on the fringes of structured society, heteronormative society, we go out into the world and make our own family. And so I did that. I went out into the world and made my own family. My friends became my family, and found family became important to me. And therefore, to the novel, I have 2 members from my found family sitting here today. I'm very happy that they're here. So the excerpt I'll read is about the main character, Shagun. He joins a street theater troupe, which is why I had done that research, because I knew I wanted him to be a performer, a street performer, and I'm very fascinated with masks. So the cover of the book is the mask of Chitrangada, who is a character from the Mahabharata who's a transgender character. And the power of masks is that they conceal as much as they reveal, because they conceal the face of the performer, but they reveal the story of the character being performed. And I think that, especially with fiction, that is very informed by self-identities or the journey to the formation of that identity. When you were talking about lies, that got me thinking. I think a story like that is a lie that we wish was true. And so for me, writing the story was a lie that I wish was true. But the part that did end up becoming true was that of the found family. So this section that I'm going to read, the main character is on the run, and his found family, which is his best friend Sue, and his fellow performers help him escape. So that's the sequence I'm going to read. I chose that section because I grew up on Hindi cinema and I love anything dramatic. And this is a dramatic sequence. Over the last few months, I'd acquired a Ken doll, one retro outfit, and the Dravidian book of seas and stargazing. I packed them with the few clothes that had arrived in the bag that arrived with. The bed was stripped, the room empty, ready for the next occupant. When Sue came by, we took my bag to the balcony and sat on it. She pressed my head to her shoulder and let me cry. When she sensed that the storm of my grief had subsided for now, she let me go. "What do you want?" she said, like from life. "I want a celebration," I said. "I want to perform something beautiful and intimate with Rue and with Saya. I want you to come see Mark and me running off into our bridal night. And, oh, I want my mother to be there too. I mean, why not, if wishes were horses and all that." "Run off into our bridal night," Sue mocked. "You're such a drama queen." We laughed. "You want a celebration? You'll get one." Sue walked with me up one floor. My students, all 6 of them, were in Nandi's room. So were the other members of my troupe. We commenced my preparations to stage my escape. We traded our clothes for costumes. The room, like the green room, was lamplit. And in the light of those flames, the bowls of makeup resembled precious stones, green like emerald, red like ruby, blue like lapis lazuli. The only movement was the hand of a makeup man whose brush traced the contours of our faces, leaving in its wake trails of color, bright and viscous. Nandi started to sing a song, and Rue joined him, and Saya joined him, and then I did. The makeup man's mouth twitched into a smile, even as his eyes were fixed on the faces our faces were becoming. Sue and my students listened to us, and every time we repeated the chorus, they hummed along. It was a song from the Hindu Romantic era, the Bhakti period, when art blurred the border between devotion and love, when a lover's home became your sacred address, and he, your lover, in all his fragile mortality, was no less a miracle than a god. Even after we stopped singing, we continued to hum, falling quiet one after the other, so the silence that followed felt like a continuation of, rather than a punctuation to the song. We waited, sitting upright on the bed, on the floor, our hands in our laps. And we heard our cue, a trumpet, a drum, a ululation, a human throat producing a sound that was in the register of birdsong. We filed down the stairs and exploded out of the gate, the slow rhythm of our movement escalating into something rowdier, explosive almost. I at the epicenter, dressed in regular clothing, my face painted white, on my head a wig made of jute strings, and I was surrounded by a wall of dancing bodies. Sue had my bag. From the corner of my eye, I saw the cop who was my satellite, a quick, blurred glimpse. 7 musicians surrounded us and drowned us in their music. In tandem, they blew their trumpets and struck the goatskin heads of their drums. We started to move like one body with many heads and limbs. We left the alleyway and entered the school's main street. Then out we went, leaving the campus behind, onto Market Street. Along the way, people joined us. College students, shoppers with bags of produce, couples out on evening walks dancing with us, the janta surrounding the musicians who surrounded us as we moved along. 3 winding streets later, we saw a parked minivan in one corner. The goodbyes began as we continued to move, as the musicians sustained the music at its crescendo, as strangers danced all around us. as I left the town where I met and lost the man I loved. I twirled in a circle from Nandi to Ru to Saya to Su. I gave them each a hug, pressed their bodies to mine, pressed my head to their necks and their shoulders. 3 rounds, 3 hugs for each of those humans whom I loved and who by some crazy miracle chose to love me in return. The shoulder of my costume was smudged with their makeup. We slowed but didn't stop as our bodies surrounded that minivan, pushed against it, causing it to jolt back and forth. The driver slid open the back door, leaned his upper body out, and waved his fist at us. Sue slid my bag into the van. I crouched amid oppressive bodies and entered the van through the same open door. I took my wig off and gave it back to Saya. Nandi and Ru towered over the rest as they pretended to argue with the driver. Lying flat, my stomach pressed to the bag, I watched the face of Sue, painted blue, of Saya, painted green, the red of their eyes made redder against the surrounding palettes of color. Nandi struck the minivan with his fist, and the driver slipped his body back in, slid the door shut. Ru and Nandi pressed their hands to the van's windows, and our eyes met for a moment. They were surrounded now by the people of Chamba. They were falling behind. They thumped the car once more with their palms, and then they were gone. I closed my eyes and listened to the music and their cries, relishing that oral contact, its intimacy, until I heard a rap on the window, wood on glass. The driver lowered his window. "This is no place to park," a stern voice said, and I knew it was the cop. "Sorry, sir, I just stopped for a cigarette and was about to go when they almost wiped me out," the driver said, his tone apologetic. My eyes were closed. I stopped breathing, not wanting to be heard. The driver started the engine and waited for a minute. The cop didn't say anything, and then, just like that, we drove away. The procession was headed for the railway station, where my troop members would board the train and the others would depart. When the cop checked my troop members, as I knew he wouldn't find me. The driver pulled to the side of the road about an hour later. With 2 bottles of water, I washed my makeup off. He took me to the Uttarkashi railway station. On my ticket, my name was S. Singer. As I stood on the platform with my bag and watched my train pull in, I stuffed a hand into my trouser pocket and found a piece of paper. I fished it out. Written on it in Hindi, "This isn't goodbye," signed Nandi, Ru, Saya, Su. Mark had said those words to me in a different language on the night we had our little chat. The resonance felt comforting. His promise traveling through time, finding its place in Nandi's ink in a different language. I cried for all the tentative departures from my life, for the love that tentativeness contained. Thank you.
We have probably about 10 minutes. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. 2 things. If you are asking a question, if you could hold the microphone fairly close to your mouth, because we've had great variation with people and over here and all around the place, and we're trying to record this. The other thing is, if you have a question, please ask the question. If you have a comment, please visit the authors after the session. Since there's a limited time for questions, we try to get as many in as possible. So, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Okay.
I've written it down. It might be slightly long, so I'll just skim through it really quick. So my name is Harshit Chauhan, and I'm a creative writing major at Naropa University. As an international student from India, I have often struggled with the meaning of I. I'm literally 2 different people in India and America. I'm a follower of peace, devotee of Christ and Gandhi, but also a bhakt of Krishna and Ram, understanding the importance to fight adharma with sthir buddhi, mental equilibrium. I love spending time in solitude, running and riding in the mountains, giving a big middle finger to human society. Yet, I love to serve society. I love to serve as a devotee of Hanuman. I'm a proud and devout Hindu, but I absolutely hate how the government of India uses Hindu extremism to win elections. From a spiritual perspective, my journey recently has been about dissolving the I, the ahankar, the ego within, becoming one with all, and understanding a a state I'm able to attain through running, and at a time where all these conflicting identities and crippling yet liberating voices are battling one another, how do I find the I within all these layers as a college student, as a young college student right now? Or are these all contradictory versions of myself a part of who I truly am? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing a bit about your background, your journey. I think one of the things that, for me, as I struggle with that question of I, like who am I? That's why I talked about the many selves that kind of come out. One of the things that was really important for me was learning how to decouple and hold two things that might seem contradictory in simultaneous tension. So I'll give you an example of an experience I had recently. I was at Burning Man, of all places, and I was in a sweat lodge, and somebody said, "This is sacred, but it doesn't have to be serious." And I was like, what? And it was that decoupling, right, of something that I had thought had to be together, but I could take it apart and hold them. Something could be sacred, and I thought if it was sacred, it had to be serious, but it was sacred and could be fun and not as serious. So I think there's that. And I also think that for me, it's also been a part of being really intentional about moving in and through the world, not only by having an experience, but by serving an experience. And so you talk about serving. That's the difference between being a human being, serving, versus a human doing, which in this society, we can constantly get caught up in human doing, especially in a system of academia, do, as opposed to be. And sometimes you need to be in order to serve an experience as opposed to just have an experience. So to be able to decouple and hold things in tension requires, I know Pico Ayer spoke yesterday, but it requires that stillness. It requires rest so that you need rest so that you can manifest creativity and imagination. So I would offer that.
All right, any other questions? If not, I know our panelists have questions for each other, so would you like to continue, and I'll tell you when time's up.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, one of the questions I had for both of you was about curation, that especially any work that brings so much of the self, of the many selves into our work, is necessarily an act of curation. You have 20 experiences and maybe 2 of them make it into the book. So how do you decide what gets left out and what makes it in, and what happens to what is left out and not curated?
Well, I will say that that's been my biggest problem in writing, is that it's very hard for me to keep things out. And most of my writing is really a curation, not of my personal experiences, although it can be. Like I said, these twin sisters are really, I feel now in retrospect, alter egos of myself. You know, I wanted to be a young writer. I wanted them to succeed as artists. But I've really curated a lot from other people's memories, because my book is set in the 1950s. And so my father was a natural storyteller. And as I started to write this book, I asked him more and more about his experiences in India. So the kind of more fun and lighthearted stories that he used to tell on his own, he didn't talk about partition. He didn't talk about all the suffering his family went through. But then when I questioned him, he did open up about those things. And he talked to me, I would say, pretty openly. And he himself was a person who had collected other people's stories, because he had been a boy during the partition of India. His family had to flee Lahore. And so they were living as refugees in Delhi. And they were living amongst other family members who were also refugees. So he heard lots of people's stories of how they had fled the part that became Pakistan, the part of Punjab that became Pakistan. And so he had all of these other people's, the most remarkable stories he retained, and then he would tell me those. So I had all of these stories, plus my grandmother was a big storyteller, and she remembered everything about her family, so I had hers, and I would always write everything down because I was a journalist. So every time I heard something, almost every time I talked to my father, I would then go and write everything that he said down. So I have big notebooks full of all these stories. And many of them seemed so fascinating to me. And plus, then I would, for specific aspects of the novel, I would interview other people like a journalist. And the hardest thing for me was to keep stories out of my story. And for that, I needed editors who would tell me, like, this is just, slowing it down. So I'm not a person who's very good at curation. I'm good at inclusion and trying to find threads through different subjects. But curation requires, a kind of hard-heartedness or something. And I wanted to salvage all those stories because I felt like I'm the only one that knows all of these stories, and I want to somehow make them known.
I've been told we have less than 5 minutes, so I also want to hear your answer to this same question. I think your question, I would take it in a different vein. For me as a nonfiction writer, up until now, I've been problematically curating through how I want the reader to see me. It's a manufactured image of self. We go back to ego. It's so problematic, right? And I finally started to realize that. And then I started to ask myself, what is it that you fear most about people learning about you? And write that story and tell that story. And I think for a long time, Foucault has this piece, it's called Death of the Author. And I've always aspired to Death of the Author because Foucault says you write a book and then you're supposed to die and you're not supposed to worry about how people react to it. And yet how many of us have ever been able to live that death of the author, right? What we do on the page is often a curation of what we want people to see us as. And that realization for me made me realize I couldn't take risks on the page. And yet literature, literary arts, need us to take risks on the page. They need us to do what frankly higher education is not doing and take the risks and ask the questions. And that requires us to drop the curation of self and fully die as the author, even if it means dying unto ourselves in that ego death.
It's exactly a minute left, so I'll keep this as brief as possible. So the first draft of this novel, which was my MFA thesis, was 800 pages, disguised as 500 pages because I reduced my font size and margin size. You can't pull that off with a publisher. They're not going to accept that. So for me, the way I decided what to use and what to keep was I deferred my own curiosity to Shagun's curiosity. What would he be curious about his story? And that allowed me to choose what to keep and what not to keep, which was, again, sort of letting your own ego go and letting the ego of your character rise to the surface.
Love that. All right, we did it.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your beautiful stories.